Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world. Sasquatch are real. Oh yes, that's what it means. And so it's just so exciting to be here today again with you and sharing with you another lovely story. And as I said, I do hope each and every one of you are doing exceedingly well because you guys all rock. You really do. I have such a wonderful amount of subscribers and all of you guys are just the most extraordinary people. So I consider myself very blessed. But tonight, if any of you love a graveyard story, we've got a phenomenal story for you tonight, and it happens in a graveyard, so I think you're really going to enjoy that. But before we get started, if you haven't subscribed, please do so. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Anastasia, but you can call me Anne for short, as indeed most people do. My Bigfoot encounter happened in the 80s when I was about 16 years old. I grew up in a small rural town, and the whole valley where we lived was exquisitely beautiful because there were so many acres of unblemished, untouched countryside, not to mention acres upon acres of untimbered woods that literally stretched back for thousands of miles. The streets where I lived were very colourful because the Mediterranean and Italian-style houses were painted in bright, cheerful colours that would be reminiscent of the bold, flamboyant colour schemes you see in Morocco today. If you've ever been to Marrakesh or somewhere like that, you would know exactly what I mean. Our enchanting little house was painted in a very bright, bold, sunflower yellow colour, with electric blue sash windows and a large blue front door, with an eagle-shaped golden knocker. Our front yard possessed a quintessential white wicker fence, with a little paved pathway that led to our front door. We had a very pretty terrace garden that my father maintained to perfection by keeping our front yard meticulously mown, and the flower beds were bursting with blue, yellow and white seasonal flowers to match the colour scheme of our home. It was such a stunning, eye-catching home because the blue and yellow colour scheme was so complementary, and it rarely worked. Most of the standard houses in our area all had swimming pools and porches with a barbecue area for entertainment purposes, and our spacious backyards overlooked the most spectacular mountainous views over purple-blue statuesque mountains that rose up in the blue-grey firmament like vast, rugged, majestic pyramids. On the end of our street was a cul-de-sac that ended with a very large cemetery with a typical quintessential imposing, somewhat menacing dark wrought iron gates, so reminiscent of the standard cemetery entrances you so often see in those typical horror movies. The pretty little poetic, rather enchanting cemetery was nestled in between picturesque hilly embankments which stretched back over a large area, and was flanked on the back part with an area of natural woods that I think was publicly owned property, but the mature trees there, such as the oaks, maples, spruces and cedars, were tall and majestic, and the area was teeming with an abundance of natural wildlife. Sometimes in the evening you could see deer scampering through the graveyards and eating the rambunctious grass that grew up against the gravestones aggressively, and the deers did a better job than the gardener in keeping the grass at the cemetery so short and neat. I really do believe that I never ever saw the cemetery lawns actually being mowed because of the little white-tailed helpers that they had. The 80s was a great time to be alive because life was very easygoing and relaxed, and there was little crime in our part of the world, but people invariably never worried about locking their front doors. Even my own parents were not bothered about our comings and goings, so we were pretty much free to do as we pleased without them raising a quizzical eyebrow or asking any awkward questions. Believe me, that barely ever happened. My family lived next door to a likeable, rather distinguished-looking man called Andre Markham, and he was initially from Wimbledon in London, but he had got divorced and was living with his new glamorous American wife in our very small town. He had a young, free-spirited daughter from England who had just moved in with him, and she was my age, but she appeared to dress like a goth. I was fascinated the moment I met her, though, because she wore black lipstick and elegant black clothes, and even her hair was dyed black. Her name was Olivia, and she just stood out in our small town like a breath of fresh air, because everything about her was so alluringly different, and her peculiar but glamorous strange appearance would make her clearly distinguishable in any crowd. Yet once you became acquainted with her, you would begin to realise that she was no different to any other 16-year-old girl her age, and that we had much more in common than I ever imagined possible. The first time I was introduced to the prodigious, unconventional Olivia, I was shocked because I'd never met anyone as quirky and eccentric as her before. She was wearing a bohemian long black dress with a buttoned bodice and lacy sleeves. A pretty embroidered black shawl was draped over her petite shoulders, and her white hands were adorned with a pair of black lacy gloves. A large silk black rose was propped up in her long raven black hair. I noticed that on her angular face she had plenty of black eyeliner, copious amounts of mascara that was highlighting her beautiful blue eyes, and she had the fairest, most flawless whiter-than-white skin that I'd ever seen. She also had painted a beauty spot on the side of her cheek that in a strange way looked oddly endearing and attractive. Initially the girls in our small town were a little apprehensive about befriending Olivia, as there were whispers going around that she was possibly a witch or even a Satanist, due to the peculiar way she was attired. The implications of this brutal prejudice meant that for a long time poor Olivia was very much a loner. The kids in our town whispered, derided and smirked at her behind her back, and sometimes even unashamedly smiled contemptuously at her with coy looks on their faces. The extraordinary thing about Olivia is that her friendly, warm, engaging demeanour melted our ice-cold, disparaging, pernickety hearts. Not once did she even bat an eyelid when we smirked, belittled, or even made fun of her. Nor did she try and change herself to fit our shallow perception of what a 16-year-old girl should look or behave like. I think it was her faultless fearlessness to be uniquely individual without caring what others thought of her that clearly made us secretly admire her, wishing with all our hearts that we could be as confident, posed, and assertive as she invariably was. I was the first one in our town to actually invite Olivia over for a barbecue, and when I got to know her, I realised that she was an amazing, incredibly special person, and the way she dressed never ever bothered me again. Olivia was an avant-garde trendsetter and a natural leader, and not a compliant, duteous follower, and very soon she was the most popular, influential teenager in our town, loved by absolutely everyone. What I would actually call a mover and shaker, so to speak. One day she suggested we hung around in the cemetery because it was a local spot in our neighbourhood that was in close access and walking distance from our home, with the obvious clear advantages of not having parents eavesdropping on our conversations. Then, of course, there were those prudent kids in our group who surreptitiously enjoyed a good smoke or a tot of vodka behind their parents' back. We all realised that hanging out at the cemetery did seem like such a bad idea after all. I was not keen on loitering around a cemetery with a bunch of dead people. It did not sit well with me for a while, and I wondered if it was disrespectful to the dead. I was not sure of the ethical protocol of hanging around graveyards for social interaction and fun, but my friends persuaded me that I was being oversensitive and far too impressionable. "Are you afraid of ghosts?" Olivia teased. "No," I snapped defensively. "I'm just not sure hanging out in a cemetery is the wisest thing for us to do." "It'll be fine," insisted my friends. "What is the harm with it?" Very soon the cemetery became a regular hotspot and frequent hangout for our girly conversations, and before long I became as comfortable with the tombstones as I was indeed with the white leather sofa in my own bedroom. We usually visited the cemetery in the evenings between 7 or 8 in the evening, and at midnight in the weekends. Our parents rarely ever protested, although in truth they thought we were hanging around the local area, as none of us revealed we were spending time at the cemetery. That was way too much information to offload to our parents. I began to find the cemetery a beguiling and fascinating spot. I literally loved reading the names on the tombstones, and when the person had actually died. Some of the unkept, dishevelled graves were so weathered and worn and eroded by time, you could not even read the name on the stone anymore, which really was rather sad. Many of the gravestones were of people who had died in the 1800s and even before then. I found it all incredibly intriguing, as did all my friends. So maybe some of the dead people were being remembered in a funny kind of way, so to speak, as we would ponder and examine the graves with a curious interest. One Saturday night we arrived at the cemetery at 5 minutes after midnight. It was a beautiful, exquisite night, and the dusky firmament danced with the bright twinkling stars, and the full ivory white moon provided excellent visibility. We were to discover that someone had actually recently been buried. This was not an unusual sight for us at all, as we had observed many fresh dug graves before. But we did always wonder how the person had met their end. We noticed there was a freshly dug burial mound covered with very generous bouquet of flowers, and there was no gravestone in sight, which wasn't uncommon either, because I imagine they had only just buried their loved one, and the gravestone was being made to order. Suddenly we heard this rustling sound and could detect footsteps walking towards us, and we realised that someone was coming towards the burial site. probably to pay their respects to their loved one. "Hide," I whispered. "Someone is coming." Why I did this I don't know, because it's normal to expect visitors at the cemetery, but this was indeed unusually late. Immediately we all obediently went and hid behind a very expansive modern tombstone that could easily conceal all 5 of us girls. Initially we thought it was someone coming to talk to their loved one, as I said, and I could hear that it was a man and a woman standing over the recently filled-in grave, which may have only been buried earlier in the day. "Check to see no one's coming," said the man in a husky voice, using his trowel to remove the loose compacted soil of the grave. "There's no one here," came the woman's voice. "Start digging now," she said, looking around furtively. "I never thought it would come to this," said the man's voice. "Silly old codger, thinking Mum should be buried adorned in all her expensive jewels. Crazy old man." We watched in horror as the man began to dig away the earth with his trowel, and he worked very hard and efficiently to reopen the gravesite. "Anyone coming?" he asked the woman, whom I imagined was his wife. "It's all clear," she said. "Keep digging." I wouldn't be surprised if the old codger digs her up to check if she's still wearing her jewellery collection. I'd never put anything past that crazy, foolish old man. He's as mad as a hatter, I heard the man say. Her jewellery collection is worth a fortune. "Keep digging," said the woman. "Talking will slow you down. Hurry. Come on, get on with it." Suddenly there was an owl hooting, and the man looked up in alarm. "What's that?" he said. "Frank, no one's coming," the woman assured him. "It's only an owl hooting. Go on, keep digging." My friend started to giggle. "He's digging up his mother's grave for the jewels she's wearing." "I told you cemeteries are interesting places," said Olivia. "Weird things happen here. This is amazing. I can't believe we're actually witnessing this." "Shh," I whispered. "We don't want them to hear us." Finally the man succeeded in reopening the gravesite, and we watched him jump in, and he climbed in to open the grave, and we heard him shuffling around in the open coffin. "Whew," he said. "She already stinks. The decomposing malarkey is not funny. Poor Mum, she looks so withered. This dead body business has got to be the worst job in the world. There's already maggots eating and crawling around her flesh. Awful, ugly things they are." "You've got to be kidding," said the woman. "Maggots already? Under the ground? Eating your mother's flesh?" "Hundreds of the bloody things," he said. "It's not pretty, let me tell you." "It could have been worse if we'd left it later," said the lady. "I don't need to think about that," said the man. "It's horrific enough in here with these crawling maggots. Remind me never to be buried." "Pass me the jewel," came the voice. "Quick, hurry, pass the jewels." "Everything is here," said the voice. "The old miserable codger buried her with the entire diamond collection. What a hell of a waste. I mean, who does that? These are family heirlooms. My mother would have been ticked off with Dad for doing this. She would have wanted her great-grandchildren to inherit her jewellery. Dad didn't want anyone to have a thing. The mean old slippery sod. He does not want the family to get anything, especially me, always been a miser." "Your miserable old dad is not normal in the head," said the woman. "Now come on, we need to get out of here before someone sees us or gets suspicious." We watched in amazement as diamond necklaces, bracelets and pearls that must have been worth an absolute fortune were being handed to the woman, who surreptitiously tucked them away in a little bag. "We've got them all, I think," she said. "You need to make it look the way the gravedigger left it, or your dad will be very suspicious," came the woman's voice. "I'm sure he'll be up bright and early with the larks to visit the grave and check that no one has been vandalising it. You know what he's like. We can't let him suspect a thing." Once the couple had gone, we all could not believe what we had actually just seen. It was clearly apparent that this dead woman had been buried by her husband with her vast collection of diamond jewels, and the son had come back in the middle of the night to retrieve them, hoping that his elderly father would never ever find out. "Well, I suppose," said Olivia, "it's a bit of a waste leaving diamonds to rot under the ground with a corpse. It's strange that he wanted all her jewels buried with her. I mean, those things are very precious, and I'm sure the mother would have wanted the family to inherit the jewels, but to dig the grave up to get them, isn't that a bit sacrilege? I don't know what to think. It's all a bit bizarre." "The son did the right thing," said Kate. "I mean, what a waste being buried with all that expensive family diamond that the grandchildren can one day inherit." So that was our first strange experience in the cemetery, and one that indeed convinced us that cemeteries were very cool places to hang out with. The second bizarre experience that happened in the graveyard was when we were sitting around a gravestone and two of the girls were smoking. Suddenly Kate looked very startled. She sat up, looking around anxiously. "Who touched me?" she said. "No one did," I said. "I distinctly felt someone touch me," she explained. In truth, none of us believed her, until one of us experienced our hair being tugged, and another person was physically pinched. We began to freak out. We kept hearing the strange chuckling sound, as if something or someone was finding our reactions terribly amusing. What creeped me out was this was happening without us observing the mysterious, elusive perpetrator, who surreptitiously managed to remain superbly inconspicuous. Naturally, when you're in a graveyard like this, it did make me aware of the paranormal potential that everyone else appeared to have overlooked. Could some ghostly apparition be playing games with us? I pondered to myself secretly. Every time we turned our backs, something strange would happen. Suddenly in horror we found ourselves being pelted with an avalanche of acorns that pounded us like a tornado of hailstorms. Once again we heard the amused chuckling sound, as clearly someone was finding our startled reactions extremely amusing and hysterically funny. We kept turning around to look for the culprit, but there was absolutely no one there. "I think I know who it is," said Olivia. "I think it's my stepbrother Hank, because this childish, pathetic behaviour is so typical of him," she said. "He followed us here and is pranking us, I know he is. Recently he's been putting salt in my tea and plastic snakes in my bed, and when I scream he hoots with laughter and it drives me insane. I promise you he's getting his kicks deliberately trying to scare us like this, possibly because we're in a graveyard." "Are you sure it's him?" I asked, "and not a ghostly apparition of some kind?" "Don't be silly, Anastasia. Of course it's not a ghost. It's my brat of a brother, and this is so typical of him. Wait until I give him a piece of my mind." Suddenly we were being assaulted with even more acorns, and Olivia was growing visibly annoyed. "Give it up, Hank," she shouted. "We know it's you, and we're not the least bit scared, so why don't you go back home to little mummy?" While she was doing this, I quickly slipped away, because I had suddenly detected the loitering black shadow of Olivia's brother ducking behind a gravestone and peeking at us. I was taking care that he hadn't spotted me, and I crept quietly to the gravestone and pounced on him and grabbed him, holding him down as hard as I could. But to my surprise, he did not struggle or even try to escape. Instead, Hank made a strange, frightened, whimpering sound, like a terrified small dog that was being bullied by a bull mastiff. To my amazement, I was grabbing a bunch of hair, which I assumed was a warm coat of some kind that Olivia's brother was wearing, as rather strange one at that, I might add. "Got him, Olivia," I cried. "Your brother is over here. I've got him." I noticed Hank's strange fluffy coat smelt funky, like he'd not bathed for a long while, which didn't surprise me at all, because the reputations of little boys, I knew they would evade bathing at all costs. My friend came close with her flashlight, and the light lit up what we all believed was Hank. Much to our amazement and horror, it was not the mischievous Hank that I was actually holding down, but a terrified humanoid ape-like creature covered in long, flowing dark hair. I immediately retracted my handhold instantly, hardly daring to believe what I'd been pinning down. This curious, anonymous creature was about 70 pounds, 1 foot wide and 3 foot tall, and it was covered all over its body with hair. It possessed a hairless, long, leathery face and was eyeing us with terrified eyes and looked just like a deer caught in headlights. I realised that this curious, funny little creature, with a naughty sense of humour, had been playing with us, but now that we'd actually caught him, he appeared to be very scared, reticent, and exceedingly shy. Suddenly we heard the most terrifying sound that sounded like a herd of rhinos gallivanting towards us at 100 miles an hour. Whatever this thing was, it was faster than a cheetah and swifter than the wind. It bolted unhesitantly towards us with defiant, feisty determination, and whatever this critter was, it was charging towards her youngling with a worrisome, rather frantic look on her face. The creature was clearly the young one's mother, because it was very obvious by how protective, assertive, and maternal she appeared. She let out a long stream of monkey-like chattering that sounded like she was giving her youngling a piece of her mind and reprimanding him ever so severely. I could see the little creature looking sheepish as if he knew he had misbehaved. The female critter grabbed her youngling, who proceeded to climb up his mother's back and sit with one leg dangling on either side of her shoulders. Suddenly the creature's reticence dissipated, and he sat there looking very jubilant, elated, and exceedingly pleased with himself. The mother glanced at us very briefly with a wary expression on her face that resembled an exhausted, exasperated mother who just about had enough of her child. Then she darted away very hurriedly. I sensed she didn't appreciate being seen by us. We watched her moving like greased lightning, and with such seamless grace. All the while she was chattering in a monkey kind of language that sounded like a mother giving her kid a huge telling off. I had not seen the mother very clearly, but she looked like a human, only with long flowing dark hair. But she was elephantine in size. I would say she was 10 feet tall, 900 pounds, and 4 foot wide, with very overlong arms that fell well below her knees. I could tell she was exceedingly sinewy and muscular, and had a very distinct cone-shaped head, and in her expressive deep-set dark eyes I observed a very distinctive red eye-shine in the dark. "What the heck was that?" asked Olivia excitedly. "What was it? What did we see? What was it?" "I have no idea," I said. Everybody started to talk all at once. We were so excited. We were in rapturous awe. "What did we see?" we kept asking each other. "What did we see? This was amazing." "Look what I found," I said, showing everyone a large deerskin filled with acorns. This was what the critter was throwing at us. He was a naughty little thing. We all marvelled at what we'd actually seen, and when we told our parents about our amazing encounter, our parents unambiguously dismissed our claims and emphatically ascertained that we'd been tricked by someone in a gorilla costume, or we'd seen a bear, but we had not observed what we claimed to have seen. All of us kids were quite simply disbelieved, dismissed and misunderstood, but we all knew what we had seen, and it was not an ape costume, nor by any strength of the imagination was it a bear. I think we all felt so frustrated and infuriated that no one believed our story, so we only talked about the encounter among ourselves, as everybody else clearly did not believe a word we said, and seemed to think that everything we said was fictitious and spurious. One Sunday evening my friends were smoking at a gravesite. We tended to pick a place to sit at random, as Olivia believed it was nice of us to sit around a gravesite that had not been visited for years by a solitary soul. She thought it was a kind, generous thing for us to do, as the dead person was long since departed, and their memory had died along with them. I think they might enjoy our company, she would say. I thought it was a very odd idea, but Olivia was very influential. "What a sad grave," said Olivia, sitting down on the grass and studying the grave curiously. She was using her flashlight to observe the grave closely. "Look, the engraving has all but been weathered away by time, and there is moss growing all over it, and the tombstone is so lopsided." "It must be from the 1800s or before then," I said. "Probably before then," said Olivia. Paula, one of my girlfriends, looked reflected as she started taking a puff of her cigarette. "Do you think we'll ever get to see that awesome human ape again?" she asked. "That little creature was so naughty and cute. I can't believe you actually thought it was Hank when you were pinning him down," she said to me. "It's amazing it didn't fight you back or run away or even bite you." "I'm surprised it didn't bolt away," I admitted. "I thought it would run away too when I saw what it was. It just seemed to cower in submission, and it seemed really afraid." "I don't think we'll ever see them again," said Olivia, reaching for a cigarette and taking a puff. "No, I think that mother's going to keep a stern eye on her little one from now on. I'm pretty sure of that." I could sense she wasn't pleased with the poor little critter. He only wanted to play tricks on us, but I don't think he intended to be spotted by us. We were talking for a long time, and 3 of the 5 girls were smoking copious amounts of cigarettes and stubbing them out on the earth around the tombstone, creating a messing ashtray in the ground that was very unsightly and untidy. Suddenly I felt very certain that something was watching us. I could feel eyes on me, and I looked up to see this man standing yards away at us, goggling at us with a very annoyed look on his face. "There's a man watching us," I said. "Over there. Can you see? Look, there by the cedar tree." "I did not hear him come into the cemetery," said Olivia, looking up at the man in surprise. "How odd. You'd have thought we'd have heard him." I remember thinking the man was behaving very strangely, and his face looked unusually pale and white and very distorted, and he looked like he was wearing a very, very heavy winter coat that rather reminded me of the German coats that were worn in World War II, which was strangely odd because it wasn't even cold. The man stared at us for a moment longer, and then he appeared to disappear in the woods, which was also odd because you don't exit the cemetery through the woods. "Wow," I said. "Did you see that? He went through the woods." "I wonder where he came from," asked Olivia. "Did anybody see?" It appeared that no one had observed a thing. We thought nothing more about the incident until the next morning, when Olivia informed me that she was woken in the middle of the night to find her bed shaking violently. For a moment she thought there was an earthquake, but she was soon to realise nothing else was rattling in her home, which she found incredibly odd. She reluctantly returned to bed and found her bed shaking all over again. So she looked up in alarm, and at the very end of her bed she saw the man from the graveside, who was standing there ogling her like he did at the cemetery. But then he vanished before her eyes, literally dematerialising. 1 second he was there, and then he was gone in a flash. I was so freaked out because I realised he had to be a ghost, she told me. We could not understand why the ghost had actually followed Olivia home, but the very next day it was Paula's turn to have an outer-worldly encounter. She claimed that in the middle of the night she felt something was sitting on top of her body, and it felt so heavy that for a moment she was struggling to breathe because the pressure on her chest was so huge. She screamed when she looked up, and then she observed the man from the cemetery, but she only saw his head and shoulders hovering above her body with a very disgruntled look on his face. He looked as mad as hell. "I've never been so terrified in all my life," she told us. "I ran to my parents' bedroom, and I couldn't go back to my bedroom." It did seem weird that the ghost of the man from the graveyard had visited 2 of my friends, but I was to discover he had not finished with his visitations yet. The final person to be visited by the ghost was my friend Kate. She said she was fast asleep when she was awoken to someone violently shaking her body so hard as if they were trying to get her attention and wake her up. She got up in alarm, thinking that the house must be on fire or something, to see what was going on, and there she saw these shoulders and arms and a head of a man from the graveyard floating around the room like a hot air balloon, and she said he looked furious. And suddenly she found herself being pelted with cigarette stubs, and then the ghost just vanished and dematerialised before her eyes. We examined the cigarette stubs that had been thrown at over Kate's bed, and we could see some of them had Olivia's black lipstick marks on the end, so we knew where they came from. I think we were sitting at the grave of the man that died there, and our smoking and leaving our stubs at the graveside upset him, so he visited those of us that were smoking to raise his objection, said Olivia. I think we unintentionally disrespected him from beyond the grave by littering his gravesite with our stubs. This is the reason he visited those of us that smoke. I'm sure that's what upset him. What else on earth could it be? I suggested we went back to the grave the following evening to apologise and make amends and clean the area around the grave. I even cut some white roses from my mother's garden and placed them around the grave. Olivia began her apology. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I really didn't mean to stub my cigarettes around your grave or to be disrespectful at all. I'm truly sorry to cause you such offence." "I'm also sorry," said Paula. "I really am. I don't know what else to say. I didn't think about what I was doing." "I'm also sorry," said Kate. "I feel bad for being so disrespectful. I do hope you can forgive us." We were about to return home when we saw the ghostly man again. This time he was wearing a top hat, which surprised me enormously because I didn't know ghosts could actually change their clothes. He looked at us, bowed his head towards us, taking off his top hat in a very polite, congenial way, and the angry look on his face had all but dissipated, so I guess he had forgiven us for littering his grave with our cigarette stubs. We saw him, and then he disappeared before our eyes, and he never visited us again, so I truly think he accepted our apology. From that moment on, we made sure we brought ashtrays and respected the graveyard every time we went there for a girly chat. But our experience with the ghost did not put us off going to that cemetery again, I'm glad to tell you. I was to discover many years later that the creature that was toying with us in the cemetery was in fact a Bigfoot, or a Sasquatch, or a Yeti, or hairy man. My claim to fame is I caught one, held one down. Now that's some accomplishment. So there you are. That's my story. Well, I want to say thank you so much for that lovely, lovely story. And would you, in the same situation, have gone and retrieved the jewellery from the grave? That's a question I'd like to ask you tonight. Would you have retrieved the jewellery? Until next time, goodbye and good night.